Okay, thanks. Hi there. Well, thanks to Martin and Mick for inviting me to speak. I think my paper is more of a brief personal meditation on the concepts at the heart of the event, and linked to my last visit to Rome. So, what is the question here? The question that you were asked to ask. What is the light you were required to shine upon the very methods of artists and archaeologists, historians and philosophers? Perhaps the question is, what is the value of waste? Is there any such thing as waste? What is waste? Does the concept of spolia, the ideas of Georges Bataille, the practices of artists, do these point to the conclusion that there is no such thing as waste? Or are waste and value conflated today as never before? Or perhaps, is waste a modern capitalist concept or conceit? Waste is an all too human conceit, an emotional evaluation of resources over which we believe we assert more qualitative and quantitative control than we actually do. For example, despite common parlance, it is not really possible to waste time. The busy professional who misses a flight rails in vain against time wasted until, that is, they reconcile themselves with their suddenly imposed powerlessness, with the inexorability of events beyond their control. At best, they will affirm the downtime that they've been unexpectedly gifted, not as a reward for a willful act, but as bequeathed to them, along with others so affected, by the unruly gods of chance. What we call downtime is a rare and sacred time in which more can occur than within more clearly occupied, applied or instrumentalized times. Meanwhile, the past as time we appear to have lost, which may seem abandoned, wasted, beyond the reach of our acquisitive, instrumentalizing will, is nevertheless productive in producing our present, and in this respect, the past and nothing of the past can be wasted, not a drop, not one of those moments, hours, days, those years or decades that we may have regarded in their moment and subsequently as wasted or wasteful. Just one moment of presence can transform the way we evaluate all of that apparent waste. Destruction can be deemed constructive, recuperative. Icons of one culture, one time, are torn down only to be reconfigured as pieces of the iconography of another time. We see this most obviously in the aestheticization by modern society of the ruin, the fragment of broken statuary. But it can also be seen explicitly today in, for example, Renzo Piano's grandiose and graphic Shard building in London, whose pinnacle appears pre-distressed, pre-destroyed, anticipating its own demise, even in its unveiling, its moment of innovation. We also see the constant re-evaluation of the past in our increasingly archival culture and our voracious appetite for all things retro, according to which some lack concerning the future or the present demands that the past is never allowed to die, never allowed to disappear, to be discarded or wasted. Everything is permitted, nothing is wasted. How often today do we, rich modern citizens of so-called leading nations, really get to destroy, to really discard? We daily interact with and archive merely digital, virtual signs, virtually, digitally, discarding them, if at all, only in digital, virtual waste bins that make satisfying digital, virtual simulations of a certain sound of destruction. And when we place real refuse in our real refuse bins, The ritual becomes increasingly complex, thoughtful, scientific, involving variously coloured and variously shaped receptacles, while following increasingly complex written directives. Then, most of what we discard is rapidly retrieved by teams of noble council workers who quickly ship our waste off to be reformed into our future. Can we really call this waste? As artists, we might surround ourselves with the fecundity of waste, consider the romantic image of the expressive modern painter's studio, or the writer's archive of well-ordered but incomplete manuscripts, sketches, outtakes, treasured juvenilia. We surround ourselves with this spolia as speculation, laying it down as creative compost from which further future works might grow. When everything is permitted, nothing is wasted, and waste comes in its turn to be affirmed. Francis Bacon's painting studio piled high with smeared paint and fading pages. Kurt Schwitter's rescuing a bus ticket and a button from the street, to then establish them triumphantly in a composition of equivalent values, thus championing a holistic relativism through the quintessentially modern art of collage. Such spoliation is not exceptional, not peripheral or marginal according to any hierarchical organization of values, but is rather the norm. It is the ashes that return to ashes, dust to dust, as bricks and mortar are reinvested and as yesterday's walls become hardcore for tomorrow's foundation. Spolia thus becomes the air we breathe, a kind of death in life, and vice versa. The art and thought of Robert Smithson may be implicated here, as an artist influenced by radical art historian George Kubler to consider art history within geologic and less anthropocentric time. We might also consider Aboriginal Australian and Native American Indian societies whose unframed understanding of time, value and economy lies beyond the reach of a modern representational system as a form of alterity. Given these examples of other times, other societies, waste begins to loom here as a merely local, modern concept, perhaps an aspect or conceit of modern capitalism. Thought, philosophy, a history of ideas, and the art of writing have always reused the spolia of previous attempts to seek truth, cultivate knowledge, and question preconception. As Smithson might have observed, in geologic, inhuman expanses of time, all structures of matter or of thought are mere hesitations, temporary formations, negotiating an ultimately entropic trajectory. Thus, the very aspiration to succeed, to overcome, to transcend, and to construct becomes a form of delusion, an imbalance, we might say, perhaps what Nietzsche meant by will to power. What would a life or a persona be like that truly knew how to balance value and waste, construction and destruction, reconciling our aspiration to achieve with our ultimate inevitable, inexorable, and inexplicable failure? The recycling of spolia is not an exception or curiosity, but a rule in our philosophical and historical tradition, not marginal but central. One of the least reassuring aspects of Plato's dialogues is that they entertain existing popular philosophical preconceptions only as straw men, rhetorically set up only to be cast down, trumped, their constituent parts reformed in the image of more rigorous Socratic thought. Freud's desk is littered with images of all the classical myths he will reinterpret and concoct into a medicine for the modern bourgeoisie. Hegel's dialectics require the sacrifice of every thesis on the way to a temporary synthesis. And this schema, obliquely at least, might inspire Walter Benjamin's angel of history. Benjamin's angel continues to appeal to us, not only rhyming with our sense of a disoriented journey through thought and history, but because it insists that we fix our eyes not on the reassurance and hubris associated with construction and achievement, but on destruction, the ultimate ruin of all achievement. It asks us to meditate upon the, quote, one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage and hurling it in front of the angel's feet. This one single catastrophe belies not only achievement, but the chain of events that we perceive as an organization of history into event and non-event, value and non-value, importance and unimportance, worth and waste. In denying us this chain of distinct events, Benjamin scrambles all waste with all value. In Benjamin's image of the angel of history, the spolia of one supposedly individuated historical event or philosophical idea is not revalued and reinvested in a subsequent idea or event according to the Hegelian schema, if only because there is no such convenient distinction between events and ideas, but a perhaps more Bergsonian duration. The angel sees a non-incrementalized time, sees history as one great and continuous disorganization and devaluation, all through a retrospective and helpless gaze. It's an effective and profound image, if only because modern historical man has sufficient sense of achievement, because modernity is nothing if not hubristic, and therefore needs this counter-image by means of which all progress is also destruction and all value is also waste. Here I'll take the liberty, the risk and the opportunity to briefly consider a related example of my own photography practice. Damage has evidently been done to this image. However, it is not added by means of an Instagram filter, nor caused by the natural aging of the image, but occurs in the very moment of its manufacturer, at birth, so to speak. The damage is the image the damage. The damage is as true and as valuable as the image, and the two are indistinguishable. We are not so much looking at a damaged image as at an image that, in being made, is necessarily damaged, destroyed, wasted in the service of construction. The value of the image and the relative value of its various aspects, its content, process, etc., are brought into question from the outset. The artwork intrinsically questions values, starting with its own value. Even as the plastic film base and the light-sensitive coating are ripped by being transported through the wrong, anachronistic camera, wound on an inappropriate spool, destruction nevertheless appears to create a value. The scratched surface of the photograph may draw our attention to the palimpsest that allows us to see each element both allegorically and literally through one another. We see flowers through destruction, destruction through flowers, graffiti through flowers, and vice versa, nature through culture, content through process, formation through destruction, achievement through waste. But what of the content or narrative of this photograph? Its configuration of signs. Most obviously, perhaps, there are flowers, arch signifiers of beauty, of love, of mourning, nature, fragility, and ephemerality. There is also graffiti in equal measure. Graffiti as perhaps a kind of urban flora that decorates and patinates, celebrates and berates the fabric of every city. The flowers are for sale. The graffiti is not, although this may remind us that graffiti is becoming increasingly commodified. Everything is permitted, nothing is wasted. The flowers have prices, which is always an absurdity, to place prices on flowers. The prices are given in euros, and so, though the photograph might at first sight seem difficult to place and to date, we are probably in post-EU Europe. The Dutch 17th century trading society that is often regarded as one of the birthplaces of modern capitalism abundantly celebrated and artfully recorded for posterity the relation it made between flowers, art and commerce, thereby establishing a modern aesthetic and economic value of flowers as objects of international trade, exotica destined for the middle-class domestic interior. Preserved in oil, paint, varnish, frames, glass, kept first by small collections, then museums. Their 400-year-old petals are yet to fall. Art thus suspends value, disallowing, preventing fragile ephemera from becoming waste. Meanwhile, I can't go backwards. Meanwhile, the flowers in my own photograph are cheap, common, and exotic, not protected nor carefully arranged. They cost merely a few euros. They are also, we might say, rendered cheaply, photographed with an antiquated, redundant, and discarded Brownie camera gleaned from a flea market, using anachronistic and inappropriate film. The flowers there are denied the crucial value of their colour, rendered only in shades of black and white, thus rendered austere, and yet in their very austerity made to appear more modern than the Dutch 17th century flowers. If only because everything modern becomes both photographic and inescapably historicised. This scene, these flowers, this graffiti, like my camera, were also found and photographed in a flea market, Porta Portese, Rome, a flea market where the city's dead devote their own spolia, the so-called bric-a-brac of modern life. Their cameras, films, photographs, chairs, candlesticks and bird cages to feed the future. And so there, in the flea market, the young and still upwardly mobile selectively seize upon signifiers of taste and cool, as retro chic and poverty chic emerge in response to and as an aspect of an increasingly brutalizing, totalizing economic system. New life and new values nudge a way out of the rot and failure of the old. The scarred and ripped surface of my photograph is an or meta-image that pulls flowers, prices, walls, crates, and graffiti together, synthesizing what we might like to think of as separate elements of an image, but which, like the one great historical catastrophe seen by Benjamin's Angel of History, are never truly distinct. As in life, so in art, worth and waste, damage and value are one. The rips and scars point to a base materiality shared by all aspects of the image, as well as that which is beyond, before and after the image. And here we begin to invoke the dissident surrealist and radical economist Georges Bataille, who took an interest not only in the language of flowers, but in general economy, alluding holistically to the relative value of all things, including all apparent waste and wastefulness. Cheap flowers seeded from heads that drop thousands of seeds as wild speculations, a phenomenon sometimes illustrated in the self-consciously historical art of Anselm Kiefer, provide their own spolia, also shedding petals, leaves, and blossoms. Nothing is wasted. Nature itself knows no such concept. Waste appears unnatural. Waste is invariably positive, fecund, a fertile virtue, implicating an alternative, perhaps more generous economy. For example, what might today's dominant, parsimonious and Protestant North European capitalist economists do with the profligate economic model of a creature like the camellia, queen of its own irrational economy, sovereign, emulating the even more wasteful sun that shines upon it? The camellia proliferates itself through exuberant and vivid cycles of growth and decay. We call the camellia's abundant blooms first beautiful, then ugly. Beautiful while upstanding and upreaching in their useless spectacle. Then ugly, repellent, once discoloured and deformed, once fallen into mere use as food for the earth and for the plant's even uglier roots. Pale pink petals rapidly become raw black energy, ripe for the perpetuation of self and species. Here we sense Bataille's holistic socio-economics, the language of flowers, visions of excess, the accursed share, gift economy, general economy, potlatch, sacrifice, etc. From a Bataillean perspective, progress and value in both art and life is never necessarily modern, linear, assured, and aspirational, but must also and always account for the potlatch of 1,000 seemingly wasted projects, multiple failures, errors as offerings to the gods of time and chance, all of which are returned to us in return for an as yet unknown but always implicit further return. We are allowed to consider a constant, immanent economy, an endless, formless, qualitative accountancy that avoids separate columns for profit and loss and dispenses with finalizing totals. So much is offered only to fall by the way into obscurity, into the margins, gutters and ditches, going unrecognized, dismissed, the underdogs, into the archive, out of organization, into entropy, out of time, sight and history. But this process need not break our hearts or induce in us any form of despair. It is a process shot through with hope and traces of redemption, imbued with faith, when bolstered by its own economic belief. Waste is an all too human conceit, an emotional evaluation of resources over which we believe we assert more qualitative and quantitative control than we actually do. Spolia is a useful figure that gives us access to such a conclusion. Thank you.